Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for tuning in to today's event, Securitizing Youth, Young People's Roles in the Global Peace and Security Agenda. Today's event is hosted as part of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association's Road to Geneva, which is a series of regional, national, and thematic events on environmental peacebuilding, paving the way to the second International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding that will be hosted in February 2022 in Geneva, Switzerland. My name is Amanda King, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Young Professionals Interest Group, one of the co-sponsors of today's session. Apart from my role at the association, I am the program associate for the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. And for those of you unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, it is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., created as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, and the Environmental Change and Security Program has been working for decades at the nexus of environmental change, security, and peace building. A quick word about your host of today's event. The Environmental Peacebuilding Association comprises researchers, practitioners, and decision makers working at the intersection of environmental peacebuilding. The association has a number of different interest groups focused on topics at the helm of environmental peacebuilding, and the co-sponsoring interest groups of today's event include the Young Professionals Interest Group and the Gender Interest Group. And today's event marks the launch of the new edited volume, the namesake of today's event, Securitizing Youth, Young People's Roles in the Global Peace and Security Agenda. The volume features contributions from young peace builders and seasoned scholars and practitioners alike. They examine the challenges and opportunities faced by young women and men in their efforts to build more peaceful, inclusive, and environmentally secure societies. Today's generation of youth is larger than it has been at any other time in human history, and this large proportion of young women and men is not evenly distributed across the globe. Over 600 million of these young people live in conflict-affected regions, and they also make up a majority of the population in the world's 48 least developed countries. Their experiences are strongly determined by gender and generational power dynamics. Drawing on gender-inclusive policy analysis and empirical research conducted in countries across the globe, findings from this new edited volume reaffirm the premise that efforts to promote a more inclusive approach to the parallel global peace and security agendas require the meaningful engagement of young women and men as indispensable partners. Young people's contributions to peace building and climate action must be recognized and valued if the double threats of conflict and climate change are to be resolved, and the positive synergies of the youth climate peace nexus are to be leveraged. We have a great discussion lined up for you today featuring the editor of the volume, Dr. Marisa Ensor, and two of the volume's contributors, Ali Altiok and Victoria R. Bishop. We will reserve the last 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So please feel free to chat your questions at any point in the discussion via the Zoom chat function. And please indicate your name, title, and affiliation with your submitted question. We thank you again for tuning in today to hear insights on young women's and men's engagement in peace building and positive environmental action. To start, I will turn it over to the volume's editor, Dr. Marisa Ensor. She is a gender and youth specialist with a background in the human dimensions of conflict, disasters, environmental change, displacement, and security. Trained in applied anthropology and human rights law, Marisa is currently based at Georgetown University's Justice and Peace Studies program. Her research considers the link between threats to peace and security and the politics of environmental management, forced displacement, and peace building and reconciliation with a focus on gender and youth power dynamics. Marisa is also the chair of the Gender Interest Group. Marisa, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Amanda, for that introduction and for agreeing to co-host and moderate this panel in partnership with the Young Professionals Interest Group. And thanks also to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association for facilitating this event and offering this opportunity to discuss my latest publication, our publication. Securitizing Youth is an edited volume. I didn't want to write a book about youth, but rather collaborate with youth engaged in the peace and security field. To that effect, several of the chapters have been authored by young peace builders themselves. Victoria and Ali, my young fellow panelists, are among the contributors. So the book is the result of our collective efforts to analyze and unpack the recent proliferation of international activity on youth, peace, and security. The current interest in young people's experiences and social, political, and environmental agency has been motivated by demographic imperatives as well as geopolitical realities. As Amanda noted in her introductory remarks, today's generation of youth is larger than it has been at any other time in human history. And perhaps more telling is the fact that more than 6 million of those youngsters live in conflict-affected regions. In this context, as the concept of national security has been expanded to the broader construct of human security, security agendas have been globalized. Security concerns in the global north are linked to, among other processes, political unrest, environmentally induced displacement, and fragility in more peripheral regions of the global economy where most of these young people live. This global security agenda has been further driven by moral panics over the assumed growing threat of radicalization of globally connected but marginalized youth by media-savvy extremist groups. An important landmark in this global geopolitical landscape was the adoption in December of 2015 of the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. Resolution 2250 represents the first time that the Security Council had directly addressed the central role of youth in global security concerns. It is part of a larger set of recently developed international policies and conferences on youth and security. I won't list them here. I'll just point out that 2050 is the best known, but by no means the only one. It is also worth noting that the recent ascendance of youth in global narratives of peace, security, and the environment has not been universally celebrated. Critics of this agenda have pointed out that recent documents on global youth and security are saturated with concerns with youth as threat and liability. Resolution 2050 warns that the rise of radicalization to violence and violent extremism, especially among youth, threatens stability and development. This pervasive focus has resulted in the increasing securitization of youth. This is where the title of the book comes from. And that is the propensity for young people to be seen through a lens of threat and insecurity. Our findings indicate that even youth-led peace-building organizations are not impervious to this tendency. Detractors also highlight the disconnection between discourse and practice, and the challenges or even desirability of applying global frameworks to particular local realities. Others have voiced a concern with the overly optimistic but empirically unproven expectation that youth engagement would automatically result in positive gains. Some scholars and policy analysts have argued that this ideal of youth as peace builders has served as a pretext for instrumentalizing youth and as a strategy for eliciting youth support for the current global social and economic order. It has also been noted that the inclusion and application of gender in the YPS, Youth, Peace and Security, YPS agenda, needs to be further developed and solidified as a key cross-cutting provision, correcting the lack of intersectional approaches. Youth, particularly male youth, are often branded as the main protagonist of criminal and political violence, and consequently, much of contemporary discussion carries unfavorable notions against youth, demonstrated by negative connotations surrounding concepts such as the youth bulge or at-risk youth. These stereotypes are perpetuated by the media, where youth are simultaneously infantilized and demonized, perceived to be vulnerable and in need of protection, but also denounced as dangerous, violent, and apathetic. Similarly problematic is the tendency to view the construct gender as synonymous with women, while the category youth is perceived as coterminous with young men. As a result, the role that prevalent notions of masculinity play in conflict and peace tends to be disregarded, while the category female youth has often been ignored. This has also contributed to the essentializing treatment of youth. It has It has also led to the victimization of young women and sexual and gender minorities, especially during conflict, but also in times of peace. Our analysis indicates that current policy and practice have not yet fully overcome these common shortcomings, thereby reducing the effectiveness of peace-building interventions. On a more positive note, one key thread that runs through the chapters of our volume is that the international community is progressively, if unevenly, moving away from a victim-perpetrator binary. More nuanced understandings of youth agency are directing attention to young people's positioning in relationship to the broader cultural, social, political, and environmental context in processes of both conflict and peace. And so what are the key thematic areas revealed by the empirical evidence? Well, we have identified 8 main themes. In no particular order, preventing and countering violent extremism, and Ali will elaborate on this point. 2, conflict, violence, and fragility, which is the context in which Victoria's chapter on young people's involvement in processes of transitional justice in Rwanda takes place. 3, gender dynamics, which is a cross-cutting theme throughout this entire volume and in anything I ever do. 4, the violence of exclusion. 5, education and employment as peace and security concerns. 6, youth and social media. 7, youth mobility and forced displacement. And 8, environmental governance and climate change. And I will briefly turn my attention to this theme. Okay, so we know that there is a well-documented link between climate change and matters of peace and security. Environmental insecurity contributes to political instability. Conversely, environmental challenges shared by the former parties to a violent conflict can be turned into opportunities to build lasting cooperation and peace. That's the basic premise of environmental peace building, and not a point I need to elaborate upon to our audience in this venue. Now, recent World Bank estimates indicate that by 2030, climate impacts could push an additional 100 million people into poverty. And by 2050, as many as 143 million people could become climate migrants in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. Climate impacts affect all regions of the world and cut across all sectors of society. They also put an unfair burden on future generations. Solutions to these climate-related inequities must address underlying power structures with particular attention to gender and generational dynamics. Typically, efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change have mainly focused on institutional measures and overlooked the capacity of young people to promote viable mitigation and adaptation strategies. It is imperative to identify and leverage local youth capacities and sources of resilience. However, there has been a long-standing contention that participation in politics and engagement with environmental issues, such as climate change, are the preserve of well-resourced and educated youth. Now, my own fieldwork among very engaged South Sudanese activist youth living at home in South Sudan and in refugee settlements and camps in neighboring African countries counters this assertion. They're very much engaged. An important conclusion of the book is that effective youth-inclusive approaches to peace building and conflict prevention need to be informed by the threats and opportunities posed by changes in climate and other critical environmental conditions. Efforts to improve global peace and security cannot be successful through siloed approaches. Youth-led organizations should position their comparative advantages to contribute to broader international efforts in support of peace, stability, and environmental action. Partnerships of young people working on climate change and biodiversity conservation, as well as partnerships between existing youth-focused organizations, should be encouraged if the human and planetary well-being are to be safeguarded. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to highlight that by 2050, the world's population is projected to reach 9.6 billion, up from the current 7.7 billion. Nearly all population growth will occur in less developed, conflict-affected, and environmentally fragile countries, expected to contribute, expected to continue to have very large youth cohorts. We need to bear in mind that fragility, in the case of states, and vulnerability in reference to people are not the opposite of resilience. Young women and men are often both vulnerable and resilient, often simultaneously, especially in the less developed, fragile context where most of them live. Neither trickly optimism nor alarmist, taken for granted assumptions of youth propensity for violence are accurate or representative. Policy and programming must therefore be informed by these much more complex realities if they are to be inclusive and effective and sustainable. The role of youth in peace and security, conflict and peace building, including environmental peace building, are complex phenomena that cannot be fully understood without interrogating the historical, structural, cultural, and environmental factors within particular countries, as well as the global political, economic, and environmental systems in which they are enmeshed. My final thought is the admonition that current efforts to promote a more inclusive approach to global peace and security agendas require require the meaningful engagement of young women and men as indispensable partners. So in that light, I'll turn it over to my young co-panelists.
Great. Thank you, Marissa, for that helpful overview of the volume and for sharing more about the motivation behind this work and also for outlining the current assumptions, status, and the role of young women and men globally. Really helps frame this discussion. So next we'll hear from Ali Altiok. His contribution to the volume is titled Squeezed Agency, Youth Resistance to the Securitization of Peace Building. Ali is an independent researcher specialized in youth, peace, and security agenda, encountering securitization of young people. He worked as a researcher for the Missing Peace Independent Progress Study on YPS, mandated by UN Security Council Resolution 2250. He currently works for Interpeace on YPS agenda and also coordinates civil society organization coalition on human rights and counterterrorism. Take it away, Ali.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Amanda, for moderating this panel. And also thanks to Young Professional Interest Group and the Gender Interest Group for organizing this. And also would like to thank Environmental Peacebuilding Association to raise concerns about securitization of young people and hosting this discussion. So I will start with in the context that I wrote this book chapter. I contributed to this edited volume. So as I drafted my contribution in 2018, right after the adoption of the second UN YPS resolution, Youth Peace and Security Resolution 2419. So this is the period I was, after I was working with the UN over 2 years on the Missing Peace study, as Amanda said, as a researcher, as a research consultant. So, in this position, in the position of doing research for the Missing Peace study, I was responsible to provide research support for the lead author of the study and the secretariat who was responsible for undertaking this study. I was reviewing the literature, summarizing, synthesizing evidence on the role of young people for the maintenance of peace and security. Surprisingly, but maybe not so surprisingly for many, is that what I've realized is that there is very little evidence on youth and peace building, how young people build peace, their agency in building peace. But I also came through with a lot of literature, a lot of evidence on youth and security. So the most of the written knowledge on the role of young people in the maintenance of peace and security is about how vulnerable young people are to the recruitment of armed groups, political manipulation, or about their unemployment, lack of education, marginalization, alienation, and desperation, and so on. So what I would like to say is that there are two major findings about the state of the field on YPS, on youth peace and security, which shaped my contribution to this book chapter. First is that there is a very large body of knowledge on the role of young people making societies volatile and unstable. When youth appears in the literature on security, there's a common assumption that young people are inclined to engage in violence and crime. They're about to terrorize, or they are terrorized by their peers. They radicalize, or they are about to be radicalized by their peers into terrorist acts. Young people are either the problem or they're about to become the problem. So this is particularly evident in the mushrooming literature on counterterrorism, countering and preventing violent extremism. So in short, vast majority of the literature on youth in the security field securitizes young people in diverse ways. So it's not that surprising. Securitization of young people restrict their capacity to transform violent conflicts, build peace, but also limit their freedoms and violate their human, social, economic, and political rights. So as the title of the edited volume suggests, is that there is a trend around global securitization of young people. So in this trend, there has been a major shift, as Marisa already mentioned. New global policy frameworks emerge. Is that, we speak, I mean, Marisa spoke mostly about the 2250. I would like to just touch base a little bit on the global counterterrorism frameworks. So around 2014 and 15, international counterterrorism fields started seeing young people as an asset, frontline actors against violent extremism, terrorism, or terrorism. I would like to come back to this point in a while, but for now, what I would like to say is that on the one hand, counterterrorism opened up space for young people to be prominent actors in the maintenance of international peace and security. But on the other hand, as I just said, as I just want to say is that this counterterrorism frameworks also narrow the space for young people to build peace and transform violent conflicts. As this securitization process disrupt their agency, narrow the space for them to build peace. So what I mean by squeeze agency is that the space has been narrow for young people to build peace. This is why my title of my contribution says that this is a squeeze area, squeeze agency for navigating what they want to achieve, building peace. So I now just want to come back to the literature review I was doing at the United Nations headquarters on youth, peace, and security. So my second finding was that when it comes to youth and peace, there is very little evidence to review and analyze. So of course, there are quite a few scholars writing about, or still writing about youth participation in peace building, but I rarely find documentation, knowledge, analysis about how young people build peace. There's even less evidence on the way young people interact with the process of securitization, how they resist securitization. So I use this book chapter to build evidence on how young people build peace, interact with securitization trends, and more particularly, how youth-led peacebuilding movements that emerge in the international youth-led peacebuilding movement that emerged in the last 15 years resists securitization of young people. This is why the rest of the title of my chapters says that youth-led resistance against securitization of peacebuilding. Peacebuilding has been securitized, has been increasingly securitized in the aftermath of 9/11, and which we know this is not a new problem in the field. And what I'm trying to articulate in this chapter, young people are engaging in this broad political and policy trends. So I just want to add a little bit about what I mean by what I understand from securitization. In my understanding, it might be challenged. Securitization is a process in which issues that are handled in other sectors are now addressed or transformed into security issues. So what I mean by this, for example, youth unemployment is a problem. It's a social economic problem. One needs to have a job to have enough for living. It's a livelihood issue. It's part of a decent life that you want to have sort of an income to live decent. It's not exclusively a security issue, and it shouldn't be. But if it is, it's about someone's economic security. So what securitization does is to present youth unemployment as an issue of security when it should be prioritized, framed as an socioeconomic problem, or problem of political economy. Yeah, so what securitization does is that in this process, new threats are being created and the underlying sources of new threats are being reframed. Youth often becomes the subject of this exercise, and in the way that unemployment, lack of education, poverty, psychosocial problems, antisocial behavior, and so on presented as security problems. So in the last 2 decades, as I said, that states and particularly the political elites use counterterrorism frameworks in the process of securitizing young people and their issues. And when we look at the policy trends in the multilateral system, we can see that youth as a concept increasingly mentioned in the global counterterrorism frameworks. I don't want to go into details of this, but what I want to highlight is that securitization partially moves from global to national, local levels. Norms created at the multilateral system impacts the securitization at the national or local levels. States are using global counterterrorism norms to oppress, repress, or control young people and their politics. So I should also add that this trend is not new to international relations. I mean, what I mean is that norms created at the international level has an securitization impact on at national or local level for quite a while. It was first, this process was first driven by the youth bulge theories, which portrayed young people, large youth population, as a threat to stability. So now we have a largest youth population in the world history, that when we say that the youth bulge theory didn't disappear, there is still advocates for that, shaping the international security and development sectors. So the field of counterterrorism became, in what I'm arguing, the field of counterterrorism became the primary vehicle for the securitization of young people. And I want to just say, just to articulate a bit about the agency of young people in this process, is that young people resist against this process of securitization. They mobilize, disrupt international arms transfer. At least they do advocacy work around it. They engage with actors that are typical implementers of securitization. For example, they work with security actors, prisons, or more broadly with the criminal justice system to negotiate a larger space for peace building or stopping the impact of securitization or reducing this impact. Young people protest to reclaim securitized civic spaces. They engage in creative protest action, not to be seen threatening in civic spaces. So they develop tactics, and they basically do strategic peace building. They disrupt the relationship between security firms and political establishment, which is very clear in the March for Our Lives protests in the last years. They expose corrupt relationship between money and politics in these protests, and which we all know this attracted a lot of international media attention. So this is about what I am arguing, is that what young people do is about securitization, disrupting securitization process. And I will just add 2 more points here, is that, so what I've been puzzled over the last 5-6 years is that why young people engage in counterterrorism activities when counterterrorism itself securitize their agency, punish them. So some young people engage, in my understanding, is that in my observation, some young people engage in prevention or countering violent extremism programs. They are not necessarily aware of the implications of these programs. Many are surveilled by participating in counterterror programs, but often they aren't even aware of what's going on. I mean, the background rationality around counterterror programs. Some are tokenized or instrumentalized by security actors. Some young people PVE, prevention of violent extremism, counterterrorism funds are the only funding source available to sustain their own peacebuilding work. So for some as well, I would say it's a tactical way to build relationship, as I just said a couple of minutes ago. It's a tactical way to build relationships with key actors. So in this sense, many youth organizations involve or implement CVE programs, build relationship between PVE, prevention of violent extremism, and then youth peace and security, which has been what Marisa said, that this policy trends has been so entrenched into the social political order around in international social political order. And what I see there is the counterterrorism framework is the vehicle for that. So in that sense, I just want to end to conclude with few observations or few of my kind of understanding or at the being engaged in the policy advocacy and research and working directly with young peace builders. There are quite a few of young people use CVE, PVE discourse for political advocacy within the multilateral system, which has been dismissed by the critics of securitization of young people, or who argue that YPS agenda is another agenda for securitization of young peace builders, young people overall. I think young people are interested in engaging in transforming international security frameworks. They are often very aware of the dangers around being securitized when they engage in this process. And also they are very aware of when they are co-opted or tokenistically used, particularly by counterterrorism actors. So, my conclusion, which I would like everyone to kind of take home, is that youth peace and security agenda, when it emerged around 2015, for many young people, it was as a sort of policy tool to disrupt securitization that comes from top-down securitization processes that comes from UN Security Council to their countries. And having the global youth peace and security framework and the resolutions, for many young people, it's about transforming state-society relationship, having a policy tool to negotiate with their governments with a stronger legitimacy. So this is my take of the role of young people in the global securitization of young people. So thank you, Amanda.
And thank you, Ali, for that. It was really helpful to hear more about these assumptions at the global level on the security focused views of youth, and also this kind of shift towards having them be more engaged with those opportunities for peace building. Also the view of the YPS from the youth perspective and where there might be gaps in understanding the issues youth face that lead to this securitization, but also the opportunities for peace building. So thank you. And so next we'll hear from Victoria Bishop. Her contribution to the volume is titled Securitized Youth, Transitional Justice and the Politics of Disengagement in Rwanda. Victoria is an applied researcher and scholar with a background in applied statistics and sociology. She currently works at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where her work has helped facilitate the Institute's inaugural Women Building Peace Award ceremony. Victoria continues to provide programmatic support to high-level projects of strategic institutional priorities. So I pass it over to you, Victoria.
Thanks, Amanda, and for moderating, and thank you to the Young Professionals Interest Groups and Environmental Peace Building Association for hosting this event. As Amanda just mentioned, in this edited volume, I discuss and analyze how Rwanda's transitional justice processes and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR, initiatives offer valuable lessons on young people's experiences as both objects of and actors in a range of post-1994 genocide rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reintegration. So post-genocide Rwanda is illustrative of the progressive securitization of youth. As Ali and Marisa have both noted, that is the increasing tendency to consider youth primarily or even almost exclusively in terms of their relation to security matters. And transitional justice, which is the range of measures, mechanisms, and their approaches to systematic or colossal violations of human rights, provide redress to survivors and create or enhance opportunities for the transformation of these political systems and conflicts that might have been at the root causes of these abuses. So implementation of TJ mechanisms have been complicated by the increasingly securitized constructions of youth. So this is necessary to note because youth are so crucial and such critical stakeholders of TJ and DDR initiatives and overall peace building processes. So more importantly, youth meaningful participation requires attention to the delicate balance between both trauma and resiliency. So to dive more deeper into DDR, successful disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs are often necessary bases for peace. And reintegration is often the precursor for sustaining this peace. However, like I just said, the link between the increasing securitized constructions of youth and youth-related justice processes do not always promote meaningful disengagement and reintegration. So Rwanda's youth involvement in their country's TJ and DDR initiatives is not without its contradictions and inconsistencies. So most of us are familiar with Rwanda's gacaca system, which gacaca in Kinyarwanda translates to the place where communities gather to resolve disputes, is a hybrid transitional justice approach and traditional community court system that was initiated to process the vast number of cases from perpetrators of the genocide. So this transitional justice mechanism consisted of community-based judicial forums, and it helped the community come to terms with, and was put into place to help the community come into terms with justice and reconciliation. Gacaca gatherings were an aspect of Rwandan culture dating back to pre-colonial British rule, and they were mostly to settle land disputes, so that environmental security. So what do the gacaca court systems mean for nearly the 4,500 youth that were detained in prison after the genocide? So once these court systems were officially implemented, not until 2002, the processing of alleged perpetrators at this time of the genocide, who were minors, so 14 and 18, was especially challenging because by the time of the gacaca hearings in 2002, these minors were now adults. So Rwandan youth participation in the process of gacaca courts represents a form of disengagement as it released young defendants from their involvement in violent acts and helped facilitate their reintegration into society. However, this lingering stigmatization of youth perceived as violent environmental security threats created considerable obstacles in their path toward successful social reintegration and overall sustainable peace. For instance, Rwandan male youth who were soldiers during the genocide remained on the margins of society and received little attention or support as they transitioned into adulthood. There were plenty of international aid and development organizations who sought out to help the women and young women who were who had mass atrocities happen to them. But yeah, sorry. So these both young women and men who were minors at the time have become too old to be considered youth at this time of reintegration, but yet they weren't fully considered women and men until certain societal benchmarks were achieved. So this begs the question of how do youth become adults and what happens when youth are unable to transition into society's standard of adulthood. So in these contexts where youth have experienced failed adulthood, it is often owing to unfavorable institutional and power structures that inhibit youth voices. So as the 2018 Missing Peace Report noted, that young women and men both struggle to transition into adulthood, but in different ways depending on environmental contexts. So in Rwanda, to be perceived and to gain social status as a successful man, a male youth must own land, build a house, have a successful job, marry, and have children. So at this point in the time frame during the Reconstruction era, masculinity is fragile and dependent on elements to which these young men have limited access to. So receiving a good education, owning a house, and land tenure. So if a male does not manage to achieve one of these elements, then his masculinity has been found to be jeopardized and questioned. This in turn impacts female youth's ability to transition into socially accepted womanhood, which is dependent on marriage. So Rwanda's combination of cultural tradition and the demands of the government leave youth with few or no alternatives to transitional expectations, but without the means to meet these expectations. So youth engagement in the country's socio-political life is and has been essential in advancing Rwanda's progress. So similarly, young men and women's involvement in the promotion of environmentally secure societies is also crucial. When speaking on environmental security, practical environmental interventions that can contribute to national development and sustainable peace building and reconstruction, when incrementally applied, should help strengthen social cohesion and peace. So what does this mean for Rwanda, for example, that I mentioned before, to improve public awareness of land tenure reform arrangements, including processes of distributing and demarcating land. It is also important to ensure that people, particularly youth transitioning into adulthood, perceive the land reform processes to be both transparent and participatory. So in conclusion, participation of Rwandan youth in the global YPS agenda is currently framed by multiple factors, including recognizing youth's capabilities as agents of change, promoting youth's disengagement from violent structures through implementation of DDR measures, and integrating cultural considerations in the design and implementation of transitional justice mechanisms, and in the creating of avenues for youth participation in peace building processes. So without negating Rwandan youth's past engagement in violent conflict and genocidal behavior, or minimizing their current struggles to overcome exclusion and achieve social adulthood, Rwandan youth provide an encouraging example of young people's resiliency, and their experiences underscore the positive contributions that, provided with the right opportunities, youth can make to building and sustaining peace.
Great, thank you, Victoria, for taking us to a more regional level and highlighting the case of Rwanda's transitional justice, and also that participation in the YPS agenda is complex and wide-ranging, and that youth are incredibly resilient individuals. And that is an important aspect of gender and youth development that maybe we can come back to later on, is what happens to youth leaders, and youth movements when they age out of these age structures and struggle to kind of integrate into societal norms and are in these changing structures, either in their country, a national, or even international level. So thank you all for those overviews of your contributions and for sharing your comments on young people's engagement in a wide range of contexts related to the peace and security field. So before we start our audience Q&A, I wanted to ask you all a follow-up question and a reminder to our audience to submit your questions for our panelists via the Zoom Q&A function. So Marisa, I'll start with you. I want to hear your thoughts on what are some recommendations, opportunities, and entry points to facilitate the meaningful inclusion of young people in matters related to YPS going forward.
All right, thank you, Amanda. All right, well, going forward, well, personally, I am especially inspired and heartened by the increasingly visible agency of youth, particularly female youth, in the environment security nexus. What I would like to see is more investment in the leadership of the leadership of young women and men, especially those working on peace and security writ large, including environmental peace building. And when I say investment, I mean it both in terms of allocating a dedicated budget to fund youth-focused initiatives, but also investment in terms of recognition of youth leadership and capacities and agencies, and the fact that pathways to peace can take many different forms in different parts of the world. As Ali mentioned in his presentation, there's a wide, broad, increasing body of literature documenting the negative dimension, the negative participation of youth and conflict, youth and violent extremism, and there's far fewer attention being paid to the positive recognition of their peace building agency, and that this is a problem that needs to be corrected empirically, so that it is not just a matter of wishful thinking or unproven theorized claims. I would also like to see more partnerships and collaborative action at all levels. Young people, even when they lack the experience or the connections or the resources, they still bring their energy and enthusiasm and their particular kind of knowledge of the situation on the ground. And this must be recognized and valued, with young people viewed as equal and essential partners. Okay, and this may be the hardest one. We need to acknowledge the multiple barriers, structural and cultural barriers, that constrain young people's meaningful inclusion. We need to bear in mind that in many of the conflict-affected and least developed countries where the population is the youngest, societies tend to be both patriarchal and gerontocratic. The notion of youth agency, especially female youth, is not necessarily welcome everywhere. In fact, it is often perceived as a threat to the status quo, and not just by the leaders, who tend to be elders, but sometimes also by the general population. As a result, for many young women especially, but also for young men, agency and participation in public life often come at a high price. We need to be prepared to support these brave young women and men and offer solutions to mitigate any possible risk, especially in contexts in which they are perceived as risk. We need to focus on addressing the root causes and the structural violence that relegates them to a subordinated position. In the case of the women, as both female, young, and possibly also members of indigenous or other minority community, other minority group. And doing so is the only way they will be able to fulfill their promise as agents of positive change in the environment, peace, and security nexus. Okay, I'll leave it there.
That's great, Marisa. Thank you. And, partnerships. It's incredibly important and vital. So thank you for making that point. So Ali, I will ask you the same question. What are some recommendations, opportunities, and entry points to facilitate the meaningful inclusion of young people in matters related to YPS going forward?
Okay, I will try to not recommend too much, but try to keep in a few things. I think first and foremost, we need to recognize the agency of young people in the way they interact with securitization process. That's my argument in this, in the book chapter I contribute. But I will go a little bit beyond that and to articulate, since that has been some time since the book chapter has been written, and thinking about this, is that I think it is essential for YPS agenda for, if you want to provide, promote meaningful participation of young people, we need to consider liberating YPS agenda from counterterrorism frameworks strategically. Doesn't mean that we should just oppose, but we need to explain what YPS agenda means and why it is different than counterterrorism frameworks, particularly to state agencies. So achieving meaningful youth participation is a very high bar in my view, and it's like what it means is not that clear either. So oftentimes, so I just want to say a couple things that that I think maybe could clarify this, so that we could push for it as well. Is that I think it's about, when we speak about meaningful participation of youth in peace and security matters, we need to start speaking about peace processes, security sector reform, DDR. I mean, youth stake in the DDR processes, not just beneficiaries of that, but it's actually the implementers, the ones who are making the strategic decision how DDR processes are being kind of undertaken, or criminal justice reform, seeing young people as a. I mean, criminal justice is the main interface where young people interact with their states, mostly in peace and security matters, and having young people in this, giving young people, empowering young people in that process. These are very important, and also addressing the structural barriers for young people's participation in politics overall, in governance. And just to add to that, I think probably the most fundamental thing necessary for meaningful youth participation is protecting the civic space, space that has been securitized by counterterrorism, applications of counterterrorism. So for meaningful participation, I think as another major point is that we need to move from, I mean, there is a policy angles to that we need to start moving from reactive security-based approaches to proactive understanding of how we can actually invest in, I mean, what I mean by invest is not like necessarily monetary, but it's a sort of valuing the proactively valuing young people's role in building resilience, not just against violent extremism, but their resilience for peace. There's this, and maybe I should just say one last thing about meaningful youth participation. This is not about like we hand over participation opportunities to young people. Or we facilitate their participation, but it's more about like sometimes like living the space, for young people, not to securitize that spaces for participation in ways that, like, when we're speaking about counterterrorism, for example, we systematically exclude vast majority of young people who are alienated, who may want to be interested in engaging in politics due to surveillance, due to fears of harassments, stigmatization. Those young people won't participate in politics. And we need youth political participation for resilient, inclusive societies, especially when we are saying that there is a youth bulge in many conflict-affected societies. Then we need to change our approach for how we understand what makes young people's participation meaningful. So these are my some thoughts.
Thank you, Ali. No, very strong points there. Need to recognize the agency of young people and kind of protecting that space and making sure that those who feel excluded might also feel welcome. And maybe it's something we come back to too, is how much peace and youth peace and security is really emphasized on the global scale. And so Victoria, over to you. I'm going to ask you the same question. So what are some recommendations, opportunities, and entry points to facilitate the meaningful inclusion of young people in matters related to YPS going forward?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amanda. And I couldn't agree more with Ali on youth being a part of those agents who are making those decision processes during informing DDR mechanisms and transitional justice initiatives. But yeah, I'm thinking of, in terms of Rwanda, which is one of the only countries in Africa where women constitute a majority in the government. So it's crucial to also focus on providing resources to young women because they are the future. And as in every area of peace building, and especially environmental peace building, we must emphasize the inclusion of youth in seeking these solutions, just like both Marisa and Ali mentioned before.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, agency of youth, making sure they're a part of it. It's all really important things that we need to keep in mind. So a reminder to our audience to submit questions for our panel through the Q&A chat function. And I have a few more questions actually for you all. So my first one is, so within the past few years, we've seen kind of an increase with um, youth voices and leaders with what we think is kind of having more of a seat at the table. And so my question for you all is, what do you make of this elevation of youth voices, and how do you think it has affected the perceptions of youth as actors, either of violence, but also peace builders? And so, Allie, did you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with like,
Start.
and then maybe others can jump in. And for the first question, that what should we make of like young people's like voice, that is increased youth voice in the global international policy spaces particularly. I think we have to be a little bit skeptical about that. I think there is a part that is good. We should not dismiss completely. We bringing lived experience of young people into global policy discourse. I think it's fundamental. It's necessary. But I don't want to accuse any young people speaking in international forums, but we need to be cautious about like that we don't necessarily just listen to elite youth who have access to political power or UN entities in the countries, or international peacebuilding organizations and so on. So we have to be very cautious about the profile of young people who speaks. There's often, it's like often like the same young people are being like recruited to speak in for so many different ways, and their capacity to address, or their ability to address international audience, the audience of international policymakers has been valued, and they've been asked to speak about every issue. This about development, this about violent extremism, and peace building, and I just want to say it's very easy for some young people to speak about the marginalization and exclusion of their peers, and that creates a certain feedback loop in the international policy around young people say what the policymakers wants to hear, and that feedback loop is somehow reinforce securitized approaches to young people. For example, there are quite a few young people who are just who would just go from one conference to another, would speak about how youth unemployment leads to violent extremism. What there is a correlation or causation, while actually the literature doesn't suggest that. The literature doesn't provide any sort of conclusive evidence or strong evidence at all around youth unemployment and youth participation in violent extremism. So I think it's that feedback, that positive feedback that we need to be very cautious about it. But other than that, I think it's very essential that we have youth we are creating the space for policymakers to listen to live the experience of young people.
All right, well, maybe I can contribute a few additional thoughts, although I think that Ali has already provided an excellent answer and touched upon what's really important about this situation. And so like him, on the one hand, I applaud the initiative and the agency of these young people who are speaking in global fora. And they are bringing visibility to the issue of youth exclusion, the violence of exclusion, as we discuss it in the book. On the other hand, we need to be mindful of the fact that these young people are highly unrepresentative, for the most part, of the large majority of young people throughout the world. Most of them don't have access to those spaces. Most of them don't necessarily see their experiences reflected in what is being discussed by these highly visible young people. And it is possible that that action is a bit, I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but in some cases it's a little bit tokenistic, a matter of ticking a box. And the risk is that the general public, those who are not necessarily involved in the day-to-day operations and the realities on the ground, as impacted by the YPS agenda, may be misled into believing that young people are already being given a voice because they are allowed to participate in high-level discussions. So 2 things to consider here. To which extent are those voices not just being heard, but actually applied? To which extent what they have to say is actually taken into consideration and incorporated into policy and programming? And to which extent do those visible young people actually reflect the realities, the concerns, the priorities, the expectations, and the constraints on the part of the large majority of young people, which, as we've seen, live in conflict-affected, underdeveloped, or least developed countries. I see a considerable disconnection here. And so, yes to the visibility, more representativeness also, and more action on the ground, I would say.
I think you two have hit the nail on the head there. It's a kind of a two-face situation. You know, it's great that there are these voices, but also there's a lot more to be done and a lot more representation kind of needed. And then Victoria,
I was just going to add to that and just say that, you know, the reality that peace is a process and incremental change, but it's also important to where we have documentation of where it's working, or even to acknowledge who says that it's working, and you thought to say it's working, or, you know, depending on region. But it's important to go back and reflect as well, and analyze those steps too, and how we get there.
definitely patience. It's a little needed when it comes to this. That's for sure. Okay, I have a couple more questions for you all. And again, a reminder to our audience to submit questions through the chat function. And so one of those questions I have for you, so there are a couple definitions of youth depending on cultural context. And Marisa, you kind of alluded to the difference between boys and women and their age structure when they're called each, and how that kind of sets out in society. And so I'm wondering how you think this very description of youth affects the overall impact of securitization of youth in youth-led peace building, and how much does a young leader's age impact their voice in the regional, national, or even international arena? And another question going back to kind of Victoria earlier, so what happens to youth leaders and like these youth movements when they age out of this age structure, or when they integrate more into societal norms of adulthood?
All right. Well, maybe I'll begin, and
Great.
one of you, Victoria or Ali, can contribute if you want to. So, and I actually want to build upon something that Victoria has already mentioned, which is different understandings of what it is to be a member of the category youth, or what is required to enter the category social adulthood. And so what's happening throughout the world is that the chronological understanding that we may have of being a young person doesn't necessarily reflect local understandings of youth and adulthood in other parts of the world. In the West, the global North, and I am aware of how problematic both categories are, being young and being a member of the category youth tend to be taken as coterminous. That is not necessarily the case in most of the world. Okay? The transition in the global North, the transition between childhood, youth, adulthood is a matter of chronological progression. Okay, and so you, Amanda, have talked about aging out because you were thinking of a chronological understanding of what it is to be a member of the various demographic sectors. In many countries, that transition is not ascribed, is achieved. There are certain things that need to happen. There are certain things that people need to do in order to be able to transition into social adulthood. It is not something they are going to achieve just because they are 25, 30, 40, 50, and so forth. So they don't actually age out in that sense. What happens is that they remain failed adults perennially, right? And so this is a very common pattern, right? Now, the specifics of what is required for people to transition into social manhood or social womanhood vary from culture to culture, but what is common is that adulthood is an achieved status, is not an ascribed status that is simply achieved by virtue of turning so many years of chronological age. And as Victoria mentioned, young people in countries throughout the world are growing up, are coming of age in countries that are simply not prepared to offer them the kind of access to social, political, and economic resources that they would need to be able to make that transition. And so in the case of Rwanda, for instance, and Rwanda, Burundi, it may require, especially in the case of men, it may require having the land that they need to build a house so that they are considered eligible to marry. And once they are married and potentially have children, then are they perceived as having transitioned into adulthood. And for young women, they need to wait to be asked to be married. And without that happening, they remain spinsters, failed adults permanently. And without taking that into consideration, many of the measures that are being proposed to reduce the likelihood of youth they're often categorized as youth at risk. Okay, but when we think about it, youth at risk of radicalizing, youth at risk of engaging in violent extremism, as Ali described in his presentation and in his chapter. But if we think about it, if they are at risk of being radicalized, it's really youth as risk. Okay, and so it's not so much a matter of chronological age. And I'll give you the example of Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group is categorized as terrorist in Somalia. Al-Shabaab meaning the youth in Arabic. Okay, members are of all kinds of chronological ages, and it is a name they chose themselves in recognition of the problematic situation they are confronting that prevents them from entering the category youth, social adulthood. And so without taking these differences into consideration, we run the risk of proposing programs that are completely unsuitable for the people on the ground who are being categorized as youth, because it's not a matter of chronological age. And as I mentioned in my own presentation, there's also the risk of excluding young women, because throughout most of Africa and throughout the countries where I've done my own fieldwork in the Middle East, the category youth is only understood as male youth. Okay, this is not a pattern common in Latin America. It's not a universal pattern, but in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, the countries with the largest demographic sectors of youth bulges, and I realize that is a negative term. Youth is understood as only men because young women may be married off very young, and so they go directly from being little girls to being married women. And the other side of this problematic situation is that young adolescent girls are the demographic sector that is the most marginalized in terms of programming. There's far fewer even scholarly attention as well as programmatic interventions addressing the special needs of adolescent girls, because they tend to be either lumped with girls or with women. Their special needs and requirements, as well as their ability to contribute to the process, tends to be ignored. So yeah, that is hugely problematic. The different ways in which we understand what it is to be a member of the category youth, which is different from being young. Being young is a chronological or based on chronological criteria. Being a member of the youth category is a social label.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I spoke longer than I intended.
No,
All right.
it's helpful and grounding to hear that, and reminder of that kind of distinction of what's going on when examining youth peace and security. Ali or Victoria, did either of you have
I mean,
thoughts?
I can just say a couple more words about the
Absolutely.
what Marisa said, and kind of make this more build on what she already said. Yeah, it's I do also. I mean, there is the concept of waithood, that we are seeing young people to be stuck, or also that's another term, that they're stuck in being young or youth, and their transition into adulthood doesn't come time. So doesn't they just cannot transit into adulthood, and we have this phenomenon. I guess it was from Sierra Leone, is the the song "Youth Man." Mark Summers cites in his books all the time. So so that problem, I think, is very big. But what I want to kind of to that question, want to take a little slightly different kind of approach, kind of focus, is that what happens to youth movements when they age out of the youth category? I mean, what happens to a movement when it's a youth movement and doesn't when the members are aging out of being a young or youth? So that's a very specific and unique problem for the youth peace and security field. Many young people, when after working in a youth-led organizations or youth focused organizations, they transit into adulthood and they move into different sectors or do different things, or they stop seeing the issues from a youth lens, which is the very common pattern. And this is a unique problem. I mean, when it's compared to how women movements are being built, there is a huge difference, because women movements are usually are capable of becoming long-standing. They're able to build kind of institutions, memory for advocacy, for changing norms. This is often not the case for youth movements, and the youth movements suffer from a certain disorganizations among them, and the temporal kind of being a temporal movement. So this is a challenge for youth peace building, and this is one of the reasons I think I'm kind of speculating about this. I think this is one of the reasons why we have less evidence on young people's positive roles, that are because young people don't write about themselves when they are young. So yeah, and yeah, this is what I wanted to say. I mean, if I can, yeah, I want to just stop here. Yeah, okay.
Well, that's part of the reason why I was so thrilled that the two of you and several other of the contributors agreed to contribute a book to a chapter to the book. We can no longer say that young people don't write about their own experiences, because you did. So
Yay.
I'm applauding your efforts.
Yes, Marisa and Ali, I couldn't have said it any better than that. I guess the only thing that I could add is just that as as more youth are participating and are engaging and are have those opportunities, the avenues will widen. And so as this cohort transition into or integrate into societal norms of adulthood, womanhood, manhood, then that those avenues that are wide and allow for more people to go through. I mean, that's the ideal, right? But as Ali mentioned, that's definitely a challenge and something that we should continue to analyze.
I love that. Forever young. Exactly. Still figuring it out.
Yeah.
Okay. And that kind of leads really well into our next question. So we have a question from Claire Doyle, who's a volunteer with the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And her question is, we've kind of spoken about it, but could you elaborate on how climate change and environmental degradation might offer unique opportunities or challenges specifically for meaningful youth involvement in security and peace processes? Are there lessons from the climate movement for meaningful youth involvement in peace and security? An example being, and what we've touched on is in the climate and environmental justice movements have seen a lot of momentum driven by youth, and youth are increasingly gaining visibility for their leadership in this field. So if anyone wants to jump in with their thoughts on that question.
All right, so excuse me. So as a whole, the book doesn't focus on environmental peace building or environmental issues in general, but they are a theme that runs through several of the chapters in a very inductive manner, simply as a result of the fact that young people on the ground are aware of the ways in which they are affected by environmental issues and climate change and conservation, loss of diversity and so forth and so on, depending on the country. And so as I mentioned in my initial intervention, the point has been made that it is only more highly educated, more elite young people who have the luxury of being involved in environmental issues. And one of the reasons why my chapter, there's an entire chapter discussing environmental issues. And I chose to focus on South Sudan in part because I always find a way to focus on South Sudan. is one of 19 so far countries where I've conducted research, but it's a country that is very close to my heart. And for this purpose, I think it was the perfect case study because as much as I like South Sudan, I think that we can all agree that it doesn't meet most people's definition of an elite country, whatever that means. And so my fieldwork experience in the country is that young people, both in the country itself, as well as in the refugee camps and settlements in neighboring countries in Africa, are very much aware of the ways in which their lives are being impacted by different manifestations of environmental change. And they may not speak with the scientific language that you and I may use. They may not use technical terms. They may not refer to the latest reports by the UN, but they are perfectly aware of the fact that weather conditions are changing, that they can no longer rely on an orderly alternation between rainy seasons and dry seasons, that it's becoming increasingly harder for them to predict when is the right time for them to start their yearly migration with the cows, that the women in certain parts of the country are having a harder time walking to the areas where they would get water, and so forth and so on. And so because it is so very much part of their daily reality, these peace building groups, there's a large and increasingly growing, well, I hesitate to call it coalition because they are not really all that coordinated, but there's a large number of groups of youth peace builders. Okay, and their mandate doesn't always explicitly prioritize environmental issues, but if you look at what they're actually doing on the ground, everything is very much related to what they themselves perceived as the link between changing environmental conditions and situations of political fragility, even if they don't express it in those terms. And that they are very much aware, because they are experiencing on the ground, that issues of environmental insecurity, however manifested on the ground, but issues of environmental insecurity contribute to political instability, and they are suffering the consequences, and that, they are aware of the fact that they will be here, longer than those of us who are a little bit less young. And, these processes place an unfair burden on the youngest generations, chronologically speaking now. And I think that this is creating additional opportunities for young people to be engaged in processes of peace and security, processes of peace building. And it provides, and environmental issues provide a context that is perceived sometimes as more neutral, more collaborative, and young people from different ethnic groups, they call them tribes, are coming together to discuss a common threat or a common potential goal. And so in that sense, I think that the cases that I've studied on the ground clearly demonstrate that environmental issues provide a very promising entry point for discussions of broader issues of peace and security, and young people are demonstrating it themselves without having necessarily been schooled in this framework. They are doing it, and because it is effective, that's the strategy. The strategy that they are implementing. And last time I was there, which was right before the pandemic, we were talking about what environmental peace building is, and they love the idea of having a nice sounding title, and so they decided that they were going to call themselves environmental ambassadors. That's the name they adopted for themselves. So yeah, I absolutely agree. At least in the cases that I have done research on myself, and of course, the evidence-based needs to be greatly expanded, because a lot of the claims that have been made are too deductive, and theorized claims have not been sufficiently backed up by empirical evidence on the ground. But little by little, we are correcting this issue. We're accumulating more evidence, and the still insufficient but growing evidence clearly indicates that environmental issues provide an entry point. Depending on where we are on the ground, other issues may be top of their minds, which may not necessarily be the environment, but it is always there, because that is the very definition of the environment. It literally means that which surrounds us. So the environment always provides the context in which everything else takes place. So I perhaps I'm biased because I'm a member of the association, but I honestly believe, based on my experience on the ground, that it is a promising entry point for discussions of broader topics, and that young people, and not just those from elitist contexts, are very much aware of this potential themselves.
Couldn't agree more, Marisa. Could not agree more. Ali or Victoria, did you have any thoughts on the question?
I mean, I will just say very quick reflections on the question. My quick reaction to the question is I think what we have seen with the climate movement in the recent years is their activity in the civic space, which set a different tone or brought climate change back into the agenda of the multilateral system, when it was actually trying, during between 2016 and 20, no one was expecting climate change to be an issue that is so prominent in the agenda of the United Nations, for example, but young people managed to bring that. So there is something to be learned, of course, from the climate change movement. It's about the civic, the protests and protests and the functionality, effectiveness of the protests and protest movements. But I mean, for peace and youth, meaningful inclusion in the peace and security, it's a little bit kind of challenging issue here because young people's participation in the civic space, their protests are being repressed and they're being, criminalized. And I think what is interesting in this is just an observation. It might be not necessarily correct, is that we see young women, very young women, led the climate action, that they were tactically, maybe there was a tactic there, I'm not sure, but they were such, there was such a momentum that you couldn't criminalize their action in the way that usually radical change that is demanded by young people are being criminalized across the world on social, political, and economic issues. So it's just, I think it's just seeing that interaction is, I think, would be interesting. So I will just end here. You're muted.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Marissa. And so we're kind of running to the end of our time today. So I wanted to quickly ask you all for some of your closing thoughts based off a lot of what we've talked about today. Where do you hope more research is placed? What are your hopes for increasing this meaningful youth involvement in global peace and security agendas? What do you want the public audience to know who isn't as knowledgeable about this complex issue for advancing youth peace and security and how perceptions can change going forward? And so, Victoria, I'll actually kick it to you
Sure.
to start us off.
Yes. Well, first and foremost, like I said before, that peace is a process and it's going to involve incremental change, and just how vital it is for us to just be aware and to continue to analyze, ask questions, and just challenge the current narratives of what's going on. Yeah.
That's great. Marissa?
All right. Well, I'll just say I'll make two brief points, and that they're actually about the domestic context, which is not something about which I usually talk very much because it's not where I focus my research, but at the domestic level here in the US, there are two promising developments, and one of them is the recent adoption of the Global Fragility Act. I'm very curious to see whether it actually has an impact on the ground, whether an adequate budget is allocated and it actually makes a difference. And also at the domestic level, a potentially promising development was the introduction of the Youth Peace and Security Act of 2020, which appears to be an effort to domesticate the global youth peace and security into the domestic context. This bill was introduced on March 10 of 2020 in a previous session of Congress. It did not receive a vote, but there is a campaign underway to try to revitalize this act. I know that the Alliance for Peace Building is very much involved in this process. They even have a separate committee whose primary goal is to work to promote the Youth Peace and Security Act. And again, as with the Global Fragility Act, I'm very keen to see what the potential impact on the ground is of these two pieces of legislation. So at the very least, they signal an increased and sustained interest at the domestic level for the roles that young people are playing and can play in the peace and security agenda. And what I'm hoping is that the focus will be more on their positive and meaningful engagement. And I always emphasize meaningful so that it's as opposed to tokenistic or instrumentalized. And so, what I'm hoping, um, my highest hope is that it will not become another example of the securitization of youth,
Mm,
but something actually meaningful and positive. So that's my hope.
great. And Allie?
I mean, not to it that much. It's a. I think it's a. We do need more. A lot of. We need much more evidence on the way young people interact with the securitization processes. That's the part that's very. There are a few books emerged in the recent years, but other than that, there's really very little evidence on the way young people are. Um, you know, overseeing how what like police does or what's community. I mean, in the US, there's of course a lot of evidence, but in other, in conflict affected countries, we have very little evidence on that. And I think engaging young people in the relationship between human rights. I mean,
Mm,
engaging young people not just in peace and security, but like what is the kind of seeing young people as right bearers and seeing young people in working with young
Mhm.
people as the human rights protectors. That's a very important dimension.
I love that thought. Young people as human rights champions.
exactly.
I second that motion. All right.
Yeah, so it's building the evidence base, young people as human rights. What was it again?
I said champions, but
Champions, exactly. And then peace is a process. I think those are really good takeaways from today. So thank you, Marissa, Ali, and Victoria for such a rich and thoughtful discussion. And congratulations to you all for the launch of this volume. So thank you to the Environmental Peace Building Association for hosting today's conversation. If you're interested in learning more about the Environmental Peace Building Association, please visit environmentalpeacebuilding.org. And a recording of today's event will be available in the next day or so on the Environmental Peace Building Association's YouTube page. It'll be accessible for those of you who want to rewatch, but also those who missed today's discussion. So thank you to our virtual audience for tuning in today.